Hey church, this is the thing where we try and fill in the blanks of the story of Joseph that we had to skip over for time constraints. We can't cover all of Joseph's story in the book of Genesis on a Sunday morning, so we're going to fill in some blanks here. And we're looking at Genesis 39 today, which is one bit of the story after last Sunday and one bit of the story before the Sunday just gone, if that makes sense. So it's right before he gets sent to prison. And Joseph has been taken down to Egypt, and he is put in the household of Potiphar. Now, Joseph is a slave, and slavery is bad. The Bible treats it as bad. But Joseph here is actually treated quite well for a slave. And the reason for that is that the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. Now, the Lord, I guess, could be with Joseph, and and everything could still go wrong. That could be God's plan, is actually he doesn't prosper. But here, God's helping him to prosper. And Potiphar sees this and is impressed with this work and says, right, I will put you in charge of all the household. And what's interesting is it says, from the time that he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. So it's interesting how often in the Bible, God's blessing he pours upon the world comes through his people, through his church. He pours out his blessing through Christians, through people who trust in God, who trust in Jesus. And that's what's happening here. Joseph, someone who trusts God, who believes in him, is part of his church, and therefore God's blessing Potiphar's household through this guy. And ultimately, God's going to bless the world through one man, Jesus Christ, and then through his church, bless the world. Anyway, so Joseph's in charge, his household's thriving, but then a problem happens in that Potiphar's wife sees Joseph and finds him very attractive and says to Joseph, you should come sleep with me. But Joseph refuses because he's a righteous man. It's quite a contrast to his brother Judah, who last week was sleeping with a prostitute, or someone he thought was a prostitute. This week he says he won't. And it's interesting why he says he won't sleep with her. He says, with me in charge, my master doesn't concern himself with anything. Everything he owns is in my care. No one is greater in his house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. And then, how would you fill the sentence in? He says this: how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against who? Sin against Potiphar? But that's not what he says. He actually says sin against God. That's what his line is. He says he can't do this thing and sleep with her because he'll sin against God. Now, he clearly would sin against Potiphar if he slept with Potiphar's wife. But there's a true sense that all sin is ultimately only against God. He is the one who set the rules, who has guided us. And here in particular, he's the one who's blessed Joseph and given him all these things. So to sleep with Potiphar's wife would be an affront to God's blessing and his rule. That sin is always against someone else. But more than that, it's always against God. It's disobedience of him and breaking of his laws and rules that his commands has kept. And Joseph recognises this. He goes, if I sin here, it's not just against Potiphar. Maybe we never get caught, but it's against God himself. So Joseph refuses to go to bed with her, but she increasingly insists on it, enforcing it. And then one day it says, she caught him by his cloak and she said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in hand and he ran out of the house. He literally flees sin, which is what the Bible tells us we should do with sin, that when we encounter it, or that we should flee it if at all possible. We don't put ourselves in a situation where it is possible, and when we find ourselves in those situations, we should run from it. Now, clearly here, Joseph can run away from her. You could imagine if the genders were reversed, if this was Potiphar and Joseph was a girl, it'd be much harder for him to escape. But that doesn't mean at any point that he would have sinned. If he was raped, then that wouldn't be sin on his part. He's trying to flee sin at this point, and he does escape. But unfortunately, Potiphar's wife, her lust turns to anger, as it so often does, and she screams and shouts and pretends and lies and accuses him falsely of sleeping with her. And at which point, Joseph is thrown into prison. But again, while he's in prison, what say? The Lord was with him and grants him favour in the eyes of the prison warden. It's the same language we get at the start. Now he's getting favour with the warden as opposed to with Potiphar. And so the warden put Joseph in charge of all they held in prison, and he was made responsible for it. And so again, God's blessing people through Joseph. And also weird being Joseph right now, because God's taking you down, you've gone down to Egypt, and in Egypt you've been blessed by God and things have gone well again. And then all of a sudden things are worse than before. Now you're in jail in Egypt. You're lower than a low, but yet God's still blessing with him. I think it would be a mistake to kind of see this as like the devil fighting with God, as in the devil sends Joseph down to Egypt, but then God lifts him up, and then the devil gets him entrapped and accuses of a crime he didn't commit, but then God rescues him. It's not like a fighting thing where they're each like counter-attacking each other, or like kind of, trying to see who's going to win out. All this process, it's God who's in charge of it all. God who lets these things happen, God who permits these things to happen in order that he will put Joseph in exactly the right place, and that Joseph will trust in him so that he can use Joseph to bless all the nations of the earth.